All right, so should we get started then?
Yes.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the makeup snow day canceled Zoom version of the Finance Committee meeting for January. Um, this is being recorded and will be posted later. Today, we're going to get an update from Dr. Yanni on the status of the budget. This is a particularly challenging year given the uncertainties on both the revenue side and also the expense side. So we look forward to Dr. Yanni's update. Morning.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ridke. Today's presentation is really going to align to a few goals. So we're going to briefly review the budget year that we're in, what was approved in June 2023. We need to discuss some post-adoption developments that have occurred post-January or June 30th that are affecting this year's budget. We're going to walk the committee through our budget development process, and we'll highlight some budgetary unknowns that will affect the upcoming year's budget, and then we'll outline some expectations for the February finance meeting through June. So today is really about building that coherence around our budget, not just for the committee and the board, but for folks that might be listening or folks that might watch this presentation in the future. So in terms of reviewing revenue, and I'll ask Mr. Orlando to feel free to jump in wherever he would like. The revenue that was approved as part of this budget, you'll see in the final column there on the chart. There are two areas that I really want to highlight because the first area is the current real estate taxes, the projected revenue that we should receive this budget year. As a district, Lower Merion is really dependent upon local tax effort. In a few slides, we'll look at the percentage of our budget that comes from the local tax revenue versus what comes from state revenue and federal revenue. So that means that our community bears a lot of the burden, or most of the burden, for funding our district. The other line item that I wanted to highlight here in our discussion is interest income. So if you look at that $6 million figure, the final budget from 22-23 was 1.5 million. So that was a huge increase in interest income revenue. And that is really the result of federal interest rates being increased over time. We know that the Fed is going to, they've already signaled there's already been some rate reduction. They've made signals that they are going to continue to reduce interest rates. And so that $6 million figure that we have for this year is not going to be $6 million moving forward. Interest rates are, Mr. Orlando, do you remember our conversation of where we think interest rates are going to level out maybe in the coming year?
Yeah, I think right now we're getting about 5.25%, 5.25% interest. As of right now, the latest December of 24, they're looking more in the 4.6% range right now. They seem to be going down like every day. They seem to be going down, 5 basis points or so all the time. So that's where they're at right now. And again, as you just mentioned, we're dependent upon what the Fed does with the rates and the economy to what's going to happen.
And so in future, in future finance committee meetings, we'll be talking about where we think those projections are going to, or how those projections are going to affect the revenue side of our budget moving forward. And this is something that we've stressed to our administrative staff. This is what we've stressed to LMEA. All of these factors that are outside of our control. We can't control the housing market. We don't control the federal interest rates. So a lot of the revenue pieces are beyond our control. The basic education formula is a line that I want to highlight on this slide. We've talked about in the past that Pennsylvania's funding formula for education has been found to be unconstitutional. And so now it's really up to the legislature and our governor to figure out how to create a funding system that is more equitable across the state. So right now, Pennsylvania has the 46th least transparent education funding formula in the state, followed only by Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So there are many theories about what's going to happen. One theory is that one prominent theory is that some districts with relative wealth, like Lower Merion, will wind up seeing a reduction in state funding and have funding routed to districts that are more economically challenged. That's particularly concerning for districts like Lower Merion because we are so heavily dependent upon the local tax effort that any rerouting of state funding would mean that more of the burden for funding the district falls on the local taxpayers. There are conversations happening in Harrisburg that we're staying attuned with and keeping an eye on about particularly some new funding streams, although that means, increasing some taxes at the state level. But we're not going to know what our basic education subsidy is going to be anytime in the near future. The governor's budget address is on February 6th, but it took until December of 2023 for the state to finalize the current year's budget. So we're going to be building our budget with, best guess numbers. I don't think we're going to have really any way of really understanding what effort from the state we're going to get. So we'll be relying on Mr. Orlando and his team to look at some trends, look at what our professional organizations are talking about in terms of what funding might look like to determine what numbers we'll use to build our budget moving forward.
Steve,
Earlier,
may I ask a question? This is
sure,
Kimberly.
absolutely.
In reference to the prior slide, you mentioned other states that had similar challenges. Did they redo their budgets and either eliminate or significantly decrease the basic education subsidies to the districts that were found to have more or significantly more than the others? Or we don't know that?
Well, one prominent example would be what happened in New Jersey, actually several decades ago, but that's still happening. There was a court case that resulted in districts having money rerouted to more economically challenged districts. The court case was the Abbott court case, and I believe there's 31 districts in New Jersey that are referred to as Abbott districts. And what those districts received was a portion of funding from districts that were better funded. To be determined what will happen here. It's something that I know our professional superintendent group is watching very closely. I know Mr. Orlando through his professional group, PASBO, is watching very closely. I don't know if we're going to see this issue be resolved this year, because it's up to the legislature. It really is to be determined how long it's going to take for them to develop and then pass a new way to fund our schools.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Dr. Sontner, I think I see your hand up.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I'm in transit, so I apologize. Two questions, if you don't mind asking as we go. Sure. One about this, and then one about the previous piece that you talked about. One is sometimes when those court cases are settled, there's counter cases that delay it because the expectation and the trend of a school district having funds sets a bit of a precedent, and to upend a school district almost in the middle of the process it is typically found to be disruptive enough. Any thoughts on if they did say, okay, Lower Merion, you're getting no money, that it would be delayed until the next budget cycle?
I believe that if there was going to be some significant reduction in funding, it would be challenged and it would be delayed at least one budget cycle. That the funding case that resulted in the funding system being found unconstitutional, that actually went on for many years. I do believe that once the legislature comes up with a draft plan for what they will do, I do anticipate that there will probably be additional legal action. So it's going to be something that, as it develops, we'll make sure that the board and the community are kept abreast of, for sure.
Great. And then real quick, a question about the housing market. And correct me, I feel like I should know this, but I still am trying to wrap my head around it. So interest rates go down, housing sales go up. Don't we see, or do we see an increase of revenues when we get more of those transactional sales?
Mr. Orlando, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, that's true. As the more housing sales, you're correct. Through our transfer tax, we would see that number go up. We've been seeing that trend kind of be going down. Obviously, interest rates are high, so obviously the sales aren't maybe at the level they were 2 years ago. We had a record-breaking, transfer tax. We've seen that has come down. This year, we've seen a little bit. It's kind of stabilized a little bit, but we had some very large sales this year. A one-time, commercial properties that won't continue.
So there's a little bit of like inversely proportional revenue work that goes on, right? I'm understanding that correctly, right?
Yes.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Sorry if that was code like for other people. It just means as the interest rates go down and we get less money for that, sometimes it can be countered by the exchange of sales and the higher price points being sold, and we get revenues for that. I don't know if it's a wash, but I just wanted to understand the system.
Sure. That's a great point. Thank you. So earlier in the presentation, we talked about the lion's share of our funding coming from local efforts. So in our budget, a little over 83% of our revenue we are funded comes from local effort, and you see the state funding is just under 15%, and about 0.75%, a little more than that, comes from the federal government. So, as we move forward in whatever happens with our state's funding system, this graphic that you see here may look different. On the expense side of our budget, this is something that's not new information to any of us that are on the call, but for folks that might be new to the budget process and listening or watching this at another time, the two largest expenditures in our budget are related to salaries and benefits, so personnel in total. So as you can see there, with a budget with expenditures of $320,631,173, you'll see there the lion's share of that are salaries and benefits. And that doesn't mean that the rest of the budget is discretionary. In all of those other categories that you see there, purchase professional and technical services, property services, other purchase services, supplies, property, other objects, and other uses of funds, there's actually very little discretionary funds in here, because we, as a school district, not just Lower Merion, but school districts in general, have many fixed costs. So I don't know, Mr. Orlando, if you wanted to add anything there around salary and benefits, other than we are in a negotiation year for both our professional staff, support staff, and our administrative group.
Correct. I think you bring a good point. Salaries and benefits, as Dr. Yanni said, are mostly dictated around the labor agreements we have as far as benefits, and also what we're required by the state. Remember, PEASers, they establish the contribution rate. So a lot of them are fixed costs or mandated costs that are out of our control, not only in the 100 and 200, but also in the other objects.
So as we said, as we look at the expenditures in our budget, if you look at the large pie chart there to the right, salary and benefits make up the largest size expenditures. And if you look at that smaller pie chart there on the left, you'll see that's combined together. So 76% of our budget are salary and benefits. And sometimes people wonder if our district is in line with other districts. As we look at our peer districts and we look in general at districts across the state, our total combined percentage of salary and benefits compared to our total budget is very much in line with other districts. I think every school district in the state, because of salary and benefits, and not just healthcare benefits, but retirement and all of that really is the largest expenditure. So sometimes in my short time in Lower Merion, I've heard some community members say, or some community members have asked me, are we out of line with other districts? And we're not out of line with other districts. And in fact, in future finance committee presentations, we can I'll bring some data that will show our comparison to our peer districts and how we're right in line with them. So there were some post-adoption developments that affected our budget. So the first change that I want to talk about, and I want to be really clear before we talk about this, this legislative change, this is not about us not valuing our students. Prior to September 1st, in our state, students could be educated with our district. Students with special and unique needs, they could be educated until they turned age 21. That changed as a result of litigation at the state level. So across the state now, students with significant disabilities have the option, their families have the option to have them educated by or with school districts until they turn age 22. We learned of that, all school districts learned of that in late August, and we had to make that change very quickly. And so a number of our students who had aged out under previous parameters either returned to us or returned to placements, approved private schools that they were in. And so that cost to the districts is approximately $285,000 that was not budgeted for. And in a resource, a well-resourced district like Lower Merion, it's a hit to the budget. We can find ways to minimize the effect, but this was a huge budget hit to school districts across the state because no one had the ability to budget for it. And again, this is not about us, not honoring and not wanting to do what's right for kids. It was just a matter of timing. That means, though, moving forward, we know that students that would have aged out of our school district and aged out of our services at age 21 will be with us until 22. So now we can appropriately plan and budget moving forward. The other thing that we are continuing to face are continued challenges in recruiting transportation, cafeteria, and lunch, playground, and supervision staff. So I'm not sure if Mrs. Kalish is on the call, but she always talks about, or she always puts a plug in about trying to recruit more drivers. Despite having workforce challenges and having some labor shortages, what's actually happening is we're spending a lot of money in overtime because folks are working more hours to fill in those labor shortage gaps that we're having. So for example, sometimes we're having bus drivers actually fill in midday to do cafeteria and recess supervision, which means it's throwing them into overtime. And so as we move throughout this year, we'll be sharing some of that overtime costs. And sometimes when people hear us talk about a workforce shortage, people think, well, you must be saving money. while there is some savings in personnel costs, much of that is negated by overtime costs. So we have to be cognizant of that moving forward. So building our 24-25 budget is a work in process. So starting in October, members of the leadership team began the process of developing their budgets under the direction of both my office and Mr. Orlando. They started that work. And then in November, as they finished their budgets, we held budget meetings with members of the leadership team, Mr. Orlando and me, and then the superintendent's cabinet also reviewed each of their budgets. In December, the board accepted the administrative recommendation to approve the Act 1 opt-out resolution. That's limiting our tax increase to a maximum of 5.3%. That's the Act 1 index for this year. And later on, we'll talk about how that 5.3% is not really going to be, or it's not going to feel like 5.3% for Lower Merion, because we have to do a rescission of some debt that was previously incurred by the district. So now in January, we're giving this presentation, which is really our kickoff presentation publicly, building coherence around the budget. And then next month in the committee, we'll review the state budget proposals and the committee will receive updates on the budget development process. We'll be doing a high-level overview of revenue and expenditures. And just so that the committee knows, we have already begun our staffing process for next year. We're at the beginning stages of that. We actually sent our staff a preference survey earlier this week. We know with the implementation of universal full-day kindergarten and with the implementation of healthy start times, there may be a need for some folks to work at different levels or move into new and different positions. So we're going to be looking at all those results as a cabinet next week, and then moving that work to the principal level. And so next month, we'll be able to give you a general idea of where we are with staffing. At the March Finance Committee meeting, we would like to review the various parts of the budget with the Finance Committee so that you can see how all of the different parts funnel up or create the entire budget. We'll continue doing that in April, and then we'll ask the board to approve the proposed final budget for school year 24-25. That proposed final budget has to be out on display for a period of time before the board takes formal action to approve it. In May, we'll review fund balances and capital reserve budgets. And then in June, we'll be asking the board to approve our recommended final budget for the upcoming school year. At the top of the presentation, I mentioned that there are always unknowns that we deal with, right? So we typically always are building our budget without knowing the level of state funding that we're going to get. Governor Shapiro's budget address is on February 6th, 2024. Usually not long after that, we receive information from PASBO, which is Pennsylvania School Business Officials professional organization, and from PASA, Pennsylvania Administrators Association. And what we will receive for them would be what the governor's proposal would translate to in terms of education funding. I can't remember the last time an initial governor's proposal was similar to what was really finalized. So what we'll be able to share with you at the February Finance Committee meeting is what the governor's proposing and where we think funding might wind up. We talked about the issue of funding being found unconstitutional. So we'll see where that goes, and as I said, we'll keep the board and the community abreast of that. And just knowing that the state budget will likely not be passed by June 30th. All of the ESSER and American Rescue Plan monies that were available post-COVID They have to be spent or returned by September 2024. Most districts used ESSER ARP dollars to fund mental health supports or behavior supports. So as we go through the budget process, knowing that we're not going to have those funds available, looking at how we can achieve some of those supports within our general fund budget. We do know that the governor and much of the state legislature is committed to funding streams for continued safety dollars and continued mental health dollars, which is a good sign. Otherwise, we would be struggling to maintain some of our mental health supports that we have in school. Enrollment is going to be an unknown. When districts transition from half-day to full-day kindergarten, it is always widely unknown what the actual impact is going to be. We're starting kindergarten and first grade registration the week of February 5th. So we'll be providing updates as we go along. And we're going to watch enrollment carefully because we have projections from the Montgomery County Planning Commission, and we've also run some different scenarios. So we'll be keeping the board and the community abreast of enrollment and how that affects staffing. As Mr. Orlando and I spoke about earlier, the real estate market, when the real estate market is strong, so is our funding. And then when it's not so strong, our funding is a little bit more challenging. Interest rates we've talked about, again, as Dr. Sautner said, there is a bit of an inverse relationship. So as interest rates go down, if home sales pick up, it's always, it's not necessarily a wash, but some of the reduction in interest income may be negated by or offset by increased transfer tax revenue. So we'll see how that goes. And then we talked about labor negotiations. So we're in the process of negotiating the next LMEA contract. And just for those folks that might not be aware, we have what they call a wall-to-wall association. So professional and support staff are included in one association. So in many districts, there's a professional staff organization for teachers, counselors, librarian, nurses, and then an association for support staff. But we have a wall-to-wall association. And then our agreement with our administrative staff also expires in June. So in addition to our regular budget work that goes on, we'll be negotiating these two contracts in addition to implementing full-day kindergarten and staffing for that, and continuing to deal with some labor shortages that not only Lower Merion's facing, but I would argue in some of the hard to fill positions like bus drivers, almost every district right now is really struggling to fill those positions. And we wanted to just give an overview of real estate tax increases in the Act 1 index. So there is no tax increase or millage rate set until the board approves the final budget. So I mentioned earlier that we recommended the board and the board approved the opt-out resolution limiting the tax increase to the Act 1 index, which is 5.3%. And keeping in mind that our budget for next year has to account for the continuous improvement of all of our K-12 programming, the implementation of universal full-day kindergarten, new collective bargaining agreements, and also some individual contracts. And if you look at the chart on this screen, you'll see we've listed the last 4 years of Act 1 index percentages and what actual tax increases were. And of course, nothing is set until we recommend the final budget and the board approves that. Mr. Orlando, did you want to briefly just talk about the rescission of some of the millage this year?
So I think what Dr. Yanni is talking about is the debt service rescission for the exception that was granted years ago. That debt was paid off this past August. So under Act 1, we'll have to rescind those mills associated with that rescission, which will reduce that 5.3s below in the end when we approve the budget.
And we can explore that at the next finance committee meeting a little bit more.
Right.
And with that, I'm happy to take questions. I know Mr. Orlando is happy to take questions. Any clarification that we can provide or any assistance that we can provide, anyone on the call, we're happy to do that.
Steve, can you please come out of the thing so I can put everybody up? It's easier sometime to see the
Sure.
question. Thank you.
Denise, was there any community comment question?
Well, usually the board goes first with their questions, and then after that, we do have one resident with us today.
I don't have any particular questions. Thank you, Dr. Yanni. That was clear, and we look forward to updates in the coming months to hopefully get some clarity on some of these issues. But it was quite clear what the outstanding questions are and how we're in a limited position to make too many conclusions right now. So I'm quite comfortable with that. Any other board members have any? Mel's got a question.
I was looking because, yeah, this is really uncertain times and we're starting the new full day K and the healthy start times. And I'm wondering, I know in the last year's budget, there was looking at the staffing that would help to the transition to the additional staffing we'll need. And I'm wondering, do you have an idea of how much more staffing we'll need, or is it more of just moving staffing around and we won't have to see that big of increase since that's the biggest part of our budget?
Sure. That's a great question. Thank you, Mrs. Schaffmeister. I really think that as we implement full day kindergarten, if the projections are accurate, we'll have limited new staff. It'll be a lot of reallocating staff and moving staff around. And that's why we proactively asked staff to respond to a survey that would help us understand if people were desiring to move positions or not, so that we could start that work, so that we would have a clear picture in the coming months to say to the board, we think we can do this with existing staff, or we might need to add a position or two. The one area of staffing that is always a significant unknown is special education. We have a large number of students coming to us out of early intervention. And so Ms. Frazier and her team are constantly reviewing that. And as we go through the budget process, we'll be looking at, are there additional needs that we have specifically for that group of students? Since the pandemic, districts have seen an increase in the number of kids coming to us from early intervention. And we thought, superintendents thought last year, and we thought the year before that even, we saw the peak of those numbers, but we're actually seeing those numbers still be fairly significant.
Thank you. That answers.
All right. Well, thank you all for your time. Dr. Ricky, we had one community member. She put in the chat that she did not have any questions.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. With that, we'll adjourn the meeting and look forward to next month's update.